Sir, you can't just walk into first class because you feel entitled. That sentence didn't just land. It cut through the air like a slap in a courtroom. Sharp, loud, humiliating. And it didn't come from a stranger at the airport or a frustrated passenger. It came from the mouth of Heather Price, the lead flight attendant, standing tall and smug at the front of Atlantic Sky's Flight 431 just before the cabin door closed. All eyes turned toward the man sitting quietly in seat 2A. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't causing a scene. He was simply there, wearing a dark hoodie and jeans, calm as still water, and yet somehow, to her eyes, that alone was unacceptable. Before we go on, let me ask you, have you ever been judged just for how you look? If you've ever felt dismissed or misunderstood, hit that like button and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? What happened on this flight matters to anyone who believes in dignity and fairness. Now, back to the moment everything began. The aircraft was a Boeing 737 MAX, boarding for departure from Dallas-Fort Worth to San Francisco, a routine business route for Atlantic skies. On the manifest, nothing looked unusual, but among the passengers was a man named Julian Marks. Most people on that flight had no idea who he was, and he preferred it that way, at 48 years old. Julian was the third largest shareholder of Atlantic Skies and the CEO of a major aircraft leasing firm. But today, he wasn't flying as a figurehead. He was flying undercover, just a man on a mission. For the past 2 months, Julian had received not one, not two, but 3 internal complaints alleging racial bias and unfair treatment on this exact route. Complaints buried under polite language, but the patterns were unmistakable. Black and brown passengers made to feel out of place in first class, some subtly, some not. So Julian decided to see for himself. No press, no name on the ticket, just a regular seat, booked under a personal account, purchased fairly like any other traveler. He arrived early, cleared TSA, walked past the priority boarding lane without revealing a single credential, and quietly made his way to seat 2A. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes scanned everything. Flight crew behavior, passenger interactions, tones of voice. For 10 full minutes, he was invisible. Then Heather walked past, noticed his hoodie, and hesitated. She didn't greet him. She didn't smile. She frowned. The kind of frown that says, something doesn't add up here. She walked to the galley, peeked at the manifest, and returned with a different tone. "Excuse me," she said, voice firm but restrained. "Can I see your boarding pass, please?" Julian handed it over without a word. She looked at it, then at him, as if trying to solve a math problem that couldn't be right. "This is for first class," she said. "Yes," Julian replied simply. Her silence spoke volumes. She walked away again, but within 2 minutes, Logan Pierce, the onboard security agent, was summoned. A tall, broad-shouldered man with mirrored glasses and a badge clipped visibly to his belt. He didn't say hello. He stood beside Julian and crossed his arms. "Sir," he said, "I need to confirm your identity and verify how you obtained this ticket." Julian blinked, not in fear, but in disbelief. "Why?" he asked, calmly. Logan didn't blink back. "We've had incidents recently," he said. "People trying to sneak into premium cabins. It's protocol." Julian's voice stayed low. "So protocol now includes questioning paying passengers based on wardrobe?" Logan stiffened. "Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." And just like that, the tone was set. Not for a delay, not for a seating issue, but for something much deeper. Across the aisle, a white passenger named Brian Walker pulled out his phone. He was a freelance journalist who'd seen enough awkward moments to know when something felt wrong. He pressed record. That's when Heather made her now infamous remark. "Sir, you can't just walk into first class because you feel entitled." That word, entitled, it echoed through the cabin, as if Julian's very presence had crossed a line she couldn't accept. A black man, alone, in a hoodie, in seat 2A, unapologetic, unbothered, present. And somehow, that was too much. From the row behind, Linda Bradford, a silver-haired woman in pearls and a pale gray jacket, leaned forward. "I saw him board," she said, clearly. "He scanned his ticket like the rest of us. He belongs here." Heather didn't respond. Logan didn't move. Julian simply looked forward and breathed, not deeply, not defiantly, just deliberately, like a man who'd lived through moments like this more times than he could count. He reached slowly for his phone, not to call for help, but to activate a chain reaction that would change everything. He opened his contacts, scrolled once, tapped. One name appeared, Naomi Ellis. And with that, Part 1 ends. But for everyone watching, let this linger. What makes someone look like they belong? A suit, a smile, a shade, and more than that. Why does it still happen? In 2025, that a black man, seated quietly in a place he paid for, still gets treated like a trespasser? If that question sits with you the way it sat with every passenger in row 2 that day, then stay right here, because the story is just beginning. Julian Marks hadn't always sat in first class, let alone owned a stake in the airline flying it. Before the suits, before the company shares and the conference rooms, there was grease under his fingernails and second-hand denim that barely held up through Texas summers. He was born in the 5th Ward of Houston, where broken sidewalks outnumbered job offers, and kids didn't grow up dreaming about airlines. They just hoped to stay alive long enough to leave. His mother, Patrice, worked double shifts at the local diner, her name stitched in fading thread across her chest. His father wasn't in the picture, but his grandfather, a stern but honest man, taught him something most schools didn't, that your name meant something, and you didn't let people drag it through the dirt. Julian's first job was at 14, cleaning under the wings of small charter planes at a dusty airfield off Highway 90. He wasn't allowed near the cockpit, wasn't trusted with tools, wasn't even called by his name, just boy. Still, he stayed, because something about those machines in the sky, the way they rose against all odds, spoke to something inside him, something bigger than the streets, something freer than food stamps and overdue bills. But every step forward came with resistance. At 17, he got an apprenticeship under a white aircraft technician named Carl Whitman. The man had 30 years of flight experience and zero patience for what he called charity hires. The first time Julian touched a wrench near a fuel pump, Carl barked, "Boy like you don't belong near planes, let alone fly one." That sentence burned deeper than any engine oil. But Julian didn't talk back. He just showed up earlier the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. He took night classes, learned the mechanics, read FAA manuals front to back while other kids played ball. It wasn't that he didn't want to play. It was that he couldn't afford to lose focus. Not even once. His mother's health was failing, and he was the only one holding the household together. By 22, he had his A&P license. By 26, he was flying C-130s as a military pilot, and by 31, he'd saved up just enough to buy 2 used turboprops and start a charter company of his own, Marks Aviation. That company was the seed. He watered it with sleepless nights, meals skipped for payroll, and more rejection than most men could stomach. One bank denied him a loan and said, "You'd be better off driving trucks than trying to own planes." Another investor told him, "Black folks don't buy airlines, they ride 'em." Still, Julian kept climbing, quietly, strategically, refusing to be defined by the labels put on his skin, his clothes, or his upbringing. He reinvested every dime, acquired routes that larger airlines discarded, built trust with communities that mainstream carriers ignored, and when Atlantic Skies faced financial collapse during a leadership scandal, he made a bold offer. He didn't just invest, he saved them. Now, 15 years later, he was not only the man who'd saved the airline, he was its conscience. And yet today, on Flight 431, seated silently in 2A, wearing a hoodie instead of a blazer, all of that disappeared in the eyes of a single woman. One look, one doubt, one insult. And just like that, Julian was transported back to that hangar in Houston, standing in front of Carl Whitman, hearing those same 5 words, "Boy like you don't belong." But this time was different. This time, he didn't flinch. Because while the faces of ignorance may change, their tone rarely does. And Julian had learned that the best response wasn't rage or retaliation. It was presence, controlled, undeniable, human. The kind of presence that made people question their assumptions. The kind that held a mirror to every judgment they cast. He didn't need to argue with Heather. Her words were loud enough on their own. He didn't need to challenge Logan. The camera lens would do it for him. And he didn't need to explain himself to Captain Donnelly, because the truth was about to introduce itself without a name tag. Julian wasn't angry in that seat. He wasn't even surprised. What he felt was something deeper, a mix of sadness and resolve. Because no matter how high he'd flown, no matter how many lives he'd lifted with him, there were still people who couldn't see past the surface. And for them, power didn't look like him. Leadership didn't sound like him, and first class didn't include him. But Julian hadn't built his life to be seen. He'd built it to change what people see when they look. That was the legacy he carried. Not in his wallet, not on a press release, but in every quiet act of defiance he'd ever lived through, every time he kept his head high when they tried to bend it down, every time he helped someone else through the same doors that nearly closed on him. So when Heather narrowed her eyes and said, "We've had people sneak up here before. I won't have you be one of them." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even shift in his seat. He simply met her gaze and said nothing. Because sometimes, silence isn't surrender, it's strategy. And Julian Marks was no stranger to strategy in that moment. His past wasn't a burden. It was a compass, a reminder that this flight, this confrontation, this insult wasn't about him alone. It was about every black boy ever told he didn't belong. And this time, someone with power was ready to answer. Brian Walker hadn't planned to film anything that morning. He wasn't the type to record for attention or drama. He'd flown enough to know the difference between a bad day and a bad culture. But something about the way the flight crew handled the man in seat 2A struck a nerve. There was no raised voice, no disruption, just a quiet black man being treated like a threat for doing nothing more than existing in first class. And in 2025, that still meant something. Brian tapped the record button again. Heather had just raised her voice, not yelling, but sharp enough that half the cabin turned. "Security will remove you if you don't comply," she said, standing tall with her arms crossed. Julian sat motionless. "I am complying," he answered, evenly. "I'm in my assigned seat, and I haven't raised my voice. Is there a specific rule I've broken?" Logan Pierce, the security agent, stepped closer now, blocking part of the aisle. "This isn't about rules," he said. "It's about cooperation." Julian tilted his head slightly. "You mean compliance?" Logan stiffened. "Sir, we're not debating this." Julian nodded, his voice calm as steel. "That's a shame, because if we were, you might start to hear yourselves." Brian's camera was still rolling, a few rows behind. Passengers began whispering. One woman asked quietly, "Why's he being singled out?" Another man muttered, "You think this would happen if he were white?" And then, from the front row, a voice cut through the tension like a warm knife. Linda Bradford, elegant and unmistakably firm. "Young lady," she said, addressing Heather, "I watched this gentleman board the flight. He didn't sneak. He didn't scheme. He walked in with dignity. And he belongs right where he is." Heather blinked, momentarily thrown off by the directness of the older woman. But Julian wasn't looking at Heather anymore. He turned slightly toward Brian, toward the phone lens still recording, and for the first time since the incident began, he spoke not just to the plane, but to the world. "I know some of you are watching this right now," he said quietly, "and I want to ask you something. Have you ever sat somewhere, in a meeting, in a waiting room, on a plane, and felt like people were trying to make you disappear?" He paused, not for dramatic effect, but because the words carried weight. If you've ever been misjudged, not by what you did, but by what you looked like, hit the like button. And if you believe respect should never depend on appearance, tell me where you're watching from. Because this is still happening. At that very moment, Brian's post went live. The caption read simply, "Still happening in 2025. Flight 431. Watch this." In the span of 10 minutes, it reached over 1,000 views. Another 5 minutes, 75,000. And by the time Logan received a quiet signal from the cockpit to hold off for now, the view count had already surpassed 18,000. The hashtags began to trend. Flying while black, Seat 2A, Julian Marks. Though most people still didn't know his name yet, but what made the video take off wasn't just the injustice. It was the way Julian refused to be shaken. No yelling, no threats, just dignity. Unshakable, steady, and hauntingly calm, one user commented. "This man speaks like a professor and sits like a king. They're trying to move him, but he's not the one out of place," another wrote. "It's the eyes. He's not mad. He's disappointed, like he's seen this before. Too many times." In the cockpit, Captain Rick Donnelly grew uneasy. He hadn't seen the video yet, but word was spreading fast. A flight attendant whispered to him, "They're recording. One of them's a journalist." Donnelly sighed and radioed ground control. "Minor delay. Passenger refusal to cooperate. Might need guidance." Meanwhile, back in 2A, Julian opened his phone, not to call for help, but to activate the chain reaction he'd quietly prepared the moment he booked this flight. He tapped one name, Naomi Ellis, his assistant, his shield, and the one person who could bring the truth to the surface without raising a single decibel. 30 seconds later, Naomi's voice answered. "Ready?" she asked. Julian responded with just 2 words, "Come now." At the same time, across the plane, passengers began whispering more openly. "Why hasn't he been moved? Is it because he's right?" "No, it's because they don't know who he is yet." Someone answered, "Watch, this is about to go big." And they were right. Because while Logan remained standing like a wall, and Heather paced the aisle with growing discomfort, the world outside the cabin was starting to see the truth. Not just the man in seat 2A, but what his treatment revealed about the system flying above them all. Julian remained still. He wasn't waiting for rescue. He was waiting for revelation. And in that moment, in that stillness, something shifted. The authority didn't belong to the uniform anymore. It belonged to the man who never raised his voice, never left his seat, and never stopped looking the world in the eye. His presence wasn't a challenge. It was a mirror. And everyone, flight crew, passengers, and viewers online, was being asked to look into it. That's when the door opened again, and everything started to change. The cabin door reopened with a quiet hiss, and for a brief second, everyone on board Flight 431 paused, not because of turbulence, not because of an announcement, but because the energy in the air shifted like the first crack of lightning before a storm. A woman in her mid-30s stepped through the threshold. She wore no badge, no uniform, no dramatic expression. Just a tailored gray blazer, a leather-bound folder in one hand, and a steady gaze that cut through the noise like a scalpel. Her name was Naomi Ellis, and while few passengers knew her face, the flight crew did, or at least, they recognized the look of someone who wasn't here to fly, but to fix something that had gone terribly wrong. Heather turned first, face tightening as if instinctively sensing that her authority had just met its expiration date. Logan Pierce, standing stiff near seat 2A, took one small step back, unsure if he should intercept or salute. Naomi didn't stop walking. She made her way down the first-class aisle like someone heading into a boardroom, not an airplane. Her heels clicked once, twice, then silence. As she stood beside Julian's seat, he didn't rise. He didn't need to. "Mr. Marks," Naomi said, her voice perfectly audible without rising. "You summoned me." At that moment, it was as if every sound in the cabin got swallowed whole. A ripple passed through the rows like someone had opened a hidden page in a book everyone thought they'd already read. Julian finally looked up, not to show status, but to signal something deeper, the end of pretending. He nodded. "They asked who I was," he said softly. "Let's tell them." Naomi turned to Heather first, eyes steady. "You've just profiled the CEO of this airline, publicly, on camera, with witnesses, while performing your duties under uniformed authority." Heather's face went pale. Her mouth parted, but no words formed. Naomi continued without venom, only precision. "This man," she said, gesturing toward Julian, "is not only a military veteran and a licensed pilot. He is the third-largest shareholder in Atlantic Skies and the architect of our current diversity compliance standards, the very ones your actions just violated." Captain Donnelly, listening through the cockpit intercom, stepped out into the aisle, his lips already parting for damage control. "Ms. Ellis," he began. "This was all a misunderstanding. Had we known—" But Naomi didn't flinch. "Captain Donnelly," she said, cool and firm, "your crew made assumptions not based on security protocol, but on skin color and clothing. You knew there were complaints on this route, and now, instead of addressing them, you've given them a face. His—" Julian finally stood, not with force, not with pride, but with purpose. He looked at Heather, then Logan, then the captain. "You don't need to apologize," he said, voice low but unshakable. "What you gave me wasn't a mistake. It was a gift, a perfect, unscripted look at how far we still haven't come." Brian Walker, still filming quietly, whispered into his phone, "His name's Julian Marks. He owns part of the airline. This is unreal." Within minutes, the video hit 1 million views, then 2. National news desks started calling. Cable segments were cued. Hashtags exploded. Julian Marks, flying while black. You profiled the CEO, but inside that cabin. None of that mattered as much as the silence now pressing down on the crew. Heather looked like she wanted to disappear. Logan's arms dropped from his power stance. The passengers who had watched with detachment now leaned in, expressions shifting from curiosity to shame. One woman in row 3 placed her hand over her heart. A young black teen near the back clutched his phone tighter, eyes wide with something between pride and heartbreak. Captain Donnelly tried again, softer now. "Mr. Marks, truly, had I been informed—" Julian turned to him gently. "You shouldn't need to know someone's title to treat them with dignity." That single line hit harder than any threat. It wasn't angry. It was disappointed. The kind of tone a father uses when he's too tired to be mad and too proud to ignore the lesson. Heather, barely able to form a sentence, whispered, "It wasn't personal." Julian's reply was slow and quiet. Everything is personal when you strip someone of their humanity. Then he turned toward the passengers, not with a speech, but with presence. You all watched this unfold, he said. You saw it begin with doubt, followed by escalation, all because I wore a hoodie and not a tie. If I didn't have this name, this title, this power, I'd be walking off this plane right now, humiliated, maybe detained, and most of you would never know what happened after. Linda Bradford stood up beside him, her voice resolute. I've been flying 40 years, never seen a man handle disrespect with this much grace. You, sir, reminded me why I still believe in decency. Naomi gently placed a folder in Julian's hand. Not for dramatic effect, but because what came next would be formal, documented, actionable. This wasn't just about an apology. It was the beginning of a reckoning, one that would be written in policy, in training protocols, in the very systems that allowed this moment to happen. And as Julian looked across the aisle at Heather, he didn't speak in revenge. He spoke in memory of every moment like this, and every young person still enduring them today. You forgot something important, he said, voice like a quiet drum. People who look like me, built this industry, fought for the right to sit in these seats, and today, we're the ones flying the planes, signing the checks, and rewriting the rules. The entire cabin stayed still, not out of fear, but out of awakening. And somewhere in the back of the plane, a voice whispered what they were all thinking. They tried to remove him, and it turns out, he owns the sky. Captain Donnelly stepped forward like a man walking into a courtroom he never planned to enter. His hands were clasped, his uniform crisp, but none of it could disguise the tension in his jaw or the sweat gathering at his collar. He paused just beside Julian Marks, glancing at Naomi before shifting his focus to the man in the hoodie who now stood taller than any title in the cabin. Mr. Marks, Donnelly began, his voice low, formal, and rehearsed. On behalf of my crew, I want to offer you our sincerest apologies. Had we been made aware of who you were, this situation would have... Julian raised one hand gently, not in anger, in instruction. Stop right there, he said. You're proving my point. Donnelly blinked. Julian's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. You see, he continued, you just said, had we known who you were. That's the problem. Dignity shouldn't be a courtesy reserved for titles. The captain shifted, lips slightly parted. But no rebuttal came. Julian went on, his tone even but deliberate. I didn't board this flight to be recognized. I boarded to observe, to see whether the complaints sent to my desk were exaggerated or isolated. What I found. He paused, letting the silence make room for the truth. Was confirmation. Behind him. Passengers remained silent. All ears. Some sat with arms crossed, some with heads slightly bowed. What had begun as a disruption had now become a live case study in systemic failure, and one of the system's highest-ranking voices was narrating it. Heather Price stood near the galley wall, shoulders curled inward, her face drained of authority. Her eyes flicked between Julian and Naomi, then finally down to the floor. She took a single step forward, then another, stopping just out of arm's reach. Mr. Marks, she said, her voice trembling. I want to say I'm sorry. Truly. I didn't mean to. Her words faltered as if even she didn't believe them. Julian turned to face her, not with wrath, but with the steadiness of someone who had heard these apologies too many times before. You didn't mean to profile me? He asked. Heather looked down again. It wasn't personal. He tilted his head slightly, his voice soft but piercing. That's the thing. It's always personal to the person it happens to. You saw a hoodie. You saw skin. And you filled in the blanks with everything you were taught to fear. But let me ask you something. She raised her eyes. If I didn't own this airline, if Naomi hadn't walked on board, would you have treated me any differently? Heather didn't answer. Julian nodded slowly. Exactly. From the other side of the cabin. Linda Bradford rose again, her movements deliberate, her voice unwavering. I've seen enough in my years, she said aloud, to know when someone's heart is hardened by bias. You made up your mind about this man the moment he sat down, and now that you realize who he is, you're crawling back with empty words. That's not integrity. That's damage control. A murmur of agreement rippled through the rows. Logan Pierce, now standing awkwardly near the flight deck, shifted on his feet. He looked toward Captain Donnelly, who gave him a brief, uncertain nod. Logan approached Julian, clearly uncomfortable. Sir, he began, I was just following protocol. No, you weren't, Julian said, cutting him off with surgical calm. Protocol never asked you to intimidate. It asked you to ensure safety, not to abuse discretion. Logan looked away, lips pressed together. Naomi stepped forward beside Julian now, a folder still in her hand. We will be submitting a formal report to the ethics board, she said. This is no longer an internal issue. What occurred on this aircraft is now a matter of record, seen by millions. At that moment, Brian's phone buzzed again. He glanced down and let out a quiet exhale. 4.2 million views. He muttered, CNN's calling. Julian didn't flinch. He wasn't seeking headlines. He was seeking truth. I don't need your apologies, he said quietly. I need your awareness. I need change. And more than anything, I need you to understand this wasn't just about me. This happens every day to people who don't have cameras, or corporate titles, or assistants who can walk onto the plane and shut everything down. Heather's lip trembled. Donnelly stared straight ahead. Logan adjusted his belt, and across the cabin. The mood shifted, not from shock to comfort, but from defensiveness to reflection. Julian looked around slowly, making eye contact with strangers whose faces now wore the same expression, shame mixed with gratitude. Gratitude that someone finally said what needed to be said. A young black man in seat 5C raised his phone slightly and gave a nod of silent thanks. An older Latina woman in 3A wiped the corner of her eye, in the quiet that followed. Julian took his seat once more. Naomi placed a small notebook on the tray table in front of him. You still want to proceed with the flight? She asked gently. He nodded. Absolutely. And the crew? Naomi asked, not as a warning, but as confirmation. Julian's gaze lingered on Heather, then Donnelly, then Logan. We'll handle that before takeoff. And just like that, the tone was set, not with shouting, not with threats, but with presence, calm, purposeful, immovable. The kind of leadership that doesn't need to raise its voice to speak volumes. And though the apologies had come, late, hollow, and shaken, they could not rewrite what had already been witnessed. What mattered now was what came next. Julian sat in silence for a long moment after the apologies faded, his hands resting calmly on his lap, his breathing measured, his eyes steady. He wasn't looking for drama. He wasn't waiting for an opening. He was deciding, carefully, deliberately, how to carry this moment with the weight it deserved. Then, he rose, not with fury, not with spectacle, but with a presence so still it silenced even the cabin's quiet whispers. He turned slowly toward the three people who had made it their mission to shrink him. Captain Rick Donnelly, Heather Price, and Logan Pierce. His voice came softly at first, but every syllable landed with the weight of lived truth. Let me tell you what you didn't see when you looked at me. Julian said, you saw a hoodie, so you assumed inferiority. You saw skin, so you imagined threat. You didn't see a father. You didn't see a veteran. You didn't see a licensed pilot. You didn't see a leader. You saw what your bias let you see, and nothing more. He took one step closer to the aisle, his gaze never leaving Heather. You forgot something important. We're all human, every one of us. Crew, passengers, those watching from their phones, skin, clothes, seats. None of it defines worth. Character does. He turned slightly now, addressing the cabin as a whole. You don't have to be rich or powerful to deserve respect. You just have to be breathing. And if we've forgotten that, then no airline, no company, no country can claim to be civilized. A quiet gasp came from somewhere in the back. No one moved. Julian faced the crew again. I built this airline on a belief that no matter who you are or where you come from, you should feel safe in the sky. Today, that belief was violated by the very people entrusted to protect it. He let the silence hold, then said clearly, without hesitation, Captain Donnelly, Heather Price, Logan Pierce, you are hereby relieved of duty, effective immediately. Heather's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. Donnelly took a breath, but thought better of interrupting. Logan looked stunned, not in outrage, but in recognition. This was no bluff. This was final. Naomi Ellis stepped forward, unfolding a sealed document from the folder in her hand. Per executive oversight and shareholder protocol, Mr. Marks reserves full authority to suspend crew mid-operation when safety, ethics, or civil conduct have been breached, she said clearly. Replacement crew are on standby. Julian nodded once, then turned to the forward bulkhead. A quiet chime sounded. From the adjacent jump seat near the cockpit, a woman in a crisp uniform stood up. Amanda Lynn, the first officer, previously scheduled as standby, stepped into the aisle with poise and clarity. She had been listening to everything, and her eyes were firm with purpose. Mr. Marks, she said respectfully, I am prepared to assume command of this aircraft. Julian offered a single nod of acknowledgement. Take us home, he said, at the back of the cabin. Another crew member emerged, Marcus Green, a younger black flight attendant with a crisp Navy uniform and calm professionalism etched across his face. Mr. Marks, Marcus said, thank you for the opportunity. I'm honored to serve. Julian smiled slightly. Just be what they weren't, he replied. See people. Naomi gestured toward the forward galley, and within moments, the former crew had been discreetly ushered out, escorted down the jet bridge by a security liaison. No shaming, no spectacle, just resolution, clean, quiet, just. The door closed behind them, sealing more than just an aircraft cabin. It sealed an era of behavior that would no longer be tolerated. Julian returned to seat 2A, and as he sat down, Marcus approached. Can I offer you anything, sir? Julian looked up, his tone soft. Respect. That's all anyone ever needed. Marcus gave a quiet nod and stepped away. Then Julian reached forward and opened the small notebook Naomi had given him earlier. Inside were scribbled notes, fragments of thoughts, numbers, quotes, reminders. He flipped to a blank page, and in the top corner, he wrote 3 words. Legacy starts now, a nearby passenger whispered. Did you see that? I've never seen anything like this. Another leaned across the aisle. He didn't yell, didn't threaten, and he still shook the sky. Brian Walker was still recording, but now his hand was trembling slightly, not from nerves, but from emotion. He whispered to his audience. He didn't just fire a crew. He just redefined what leadership looks like. And somewhere, far beyond the cabin, millions were watching, not because of a scandal, but because they saw a man stand firm, not for ego, not for revenge, but for something purer, accountability, dignity, humanity. as the aircraft prepared to taxi. The sun outside the window began to crest just above the horizon, and though no words were spoken aloud, everyone on board felt it. This flight had just gone from ordinary to unforgettable. The engines hummed gently as Atlantic Skies Flight 431 finally pushed back from the gate, 21 minutes behind schedule, but carrying something far more valuable than an on-time departure. In seat 2A, Julian Marks exhaled, the kind of breath that doesn't just clear lungs, but clears history. His posture relaxed, not out of relief, but out of release. He wasn't thinking about headlines. He wasn't thinking about stock prices or shareholder reactions. He was thinking about the quiet dignity of being seen, heard, and left alone to be human. Amanda Lynn, now officially in command of the aircraft, made a brief announcement from the flight deck. "Good afternoon, passengers. This is your new captain speaking. We apologize for the delay. Our journey to San Francisco begins now. Thank you for your patience and for your courage." In that final word, courage, Julian heard more than a flight update. He heard an acknowledgement, a recognition that the past hour had been more than turbulence. It had been a reckoning. Marcus Green passed quietly through the cabin, offering service with a warmth that felt effortless. He stopped by Julian's seat and bent slightly. "Mr. Marks, can I offer you anything now?" Julian looked up, then smiled. "Yes," he said gently. "Something cold, something quiet, and something earned." Marcus grinned softly and moved on. Around Julian, passengers resumed their routines, or tried to. Some opened laptops, some put in earbuds, but more than a few kept glancing forward, just to see if the man in the hoodie would speak again, or perhaps write something down. Julian leaned back, letting the hum of the aircraft surround him, then slowly opened his notebook. He turned to the page where he'd written 3 words earlier. "Legacy starts now." Below it, he began to write something more, not for show, not for social media, but for structure, for change. A framework was forming in his mind, drawn from years of quiet observation, and now sharpened by the very experience he had just lived. It would be called the Legacy Protocol, a comprehensive training and enforcement system that would transform how Atlantic Skies, and, eventually, every airline under his influence, understood dignity, diversity, and discipline. It wouldn't just be bias training, it would be a cultural reset. Every crew member would undergo immersive education in identity awareness, trauma-informed service, and equitable crisis resolution. But beyond that, every passenger report involving discrimination or profiling would be reviewed by a new independent ethics council, with quarterly transparency reports made public. It would start with Atlantic Skies and ripple across the industry. Naomi had already drafted the preliminary policy. Julian would finalize it before touchdown. It would go into effect in under 30 days, and it would bear a name not of marketing, but of memory, legacy, because he had no interest in revenge. He wanted reform, and reform, to mean anything, had to outlive him. Julian glanced out the window as the plane lifted into the clouds. It was strange how flying always reminded him of childhood, not just because of the view, but because of the feeling, the weightlessness, the possibility. As the aircraft climbed, he thought back to every no he'd ever been given, every slammed door, every condescending smile, every room where he was spoken over, corrected, or completely ignored, until he bought the building. And now, here he was, mid-air, in control not of the cockpit, but of the culture, and not just as a man in a hoodie, but as a man who no longer had anything to prove. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folded note, yellowed from time. It was written years ago by his mother, one of the last she'd penned before she passed. It said, "Don't rise just to be seen. Baby, Rise so others don't have to crawl. Julian closed his eyes briefly, letting the words fill his chest. He whispered, "I'm trying, Mama." And he was. Because today wasn't about punishing 3 people. It was about honoring millions who've lived that moment with no camera, no witness, no rescue. This flight had turned into a lesson for everyone on board and for everyone watching from the ground. Not just a lesson in professionalism, but a lesson in humanity. Back in row 5, the young black teen who had watched everything unfold finally pulled out his phone and wrote something into his notes app. Saw a man who looked like me fire people who tried to erase him. Saw a man who didn't scream, but still changed the air. And that, Julian would later say in an interview, was the true takeaway. That quiet power isn't weakness. That grace under fire isn't submission. That correcting someone doesn't require destroying them, only holding up a mirror they can't ignore. As the plane reached cruising altitude, a final announcement came over the intercom, pre-recorded but never more fitting. "Thank you for choosing Atlantic skies. We believe the journey should feel like home, and every passenger should feel they belong." Julian smiled quietly. "Let's make sure we mean that next time." In the days that followed, the video would pass 10 million views. Networks would run the story under headlines like "Airline CEO Silently Shuts Down Racial Profiling Mid-Flight" and "The Man in the Hoodie Who Owned the Sky." But Julian never commented on the attention. He didn't need to. He just implemented the legacy protocol and watched passenger satisfaction rise to historic levels. But what mattered most to him wasn't the applause. It was the shift in behavior, in accountability, in tone. Because when the plane landed in San Francisco that afternoon, Julian didn't just exit the aircraft, he left behind a new altitude, not just of flight, but of expectation. And for everyone watching, it carried one lasting message. Never judge a traveler by the seat or the skin. We're all human. At 3,000 feet. Thanks for watching. If this story meant something to you, like, share, and let us know where you're watching from. See you next time.